Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for Vertica Unify 2021. Today's breakout session is entitled A Deep Dive into High-Impact Vertica Features. I'm Jeff Healy, and I lead marketing at Vertica. I'll be your host for this breakout session. Joining me today is Han Vu and Serge Bont from the Vertica Customer Success team. Before we begin, I encourage you to submit questions during the virtual session. You don't have to wait. Just enter your question into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We'll answer as many questions as possible during that time. Any questions we don't address, we'll do our best to answer offline. Alternatively, visit the virtual developer lounge to ask additional questions and continue the conversation with our engineers and product experts after the session. And yes, this virtual session is being recorded and will be available to view on demand this week. We'll send you a notification as soon as it's ready. Please stick around to get the code to gain points to participate in our Analyze to Win competition and win prizes. Now let's get started. Over to you, Serge.
Thank you, Jeff, for the introduction. So just a few words about the synopsis of that session, which I display here. When Han and I were asked to make that presentation, we kind of scratched our head a little bit to try to identify high-impact features, because as Vertica practitioner, any single feature of Vertica is high impact. So we looked into our kind of collective experience with Vertica in support, in running workshops, in helping design Vertica clusters. And we identified a number of features that we wished people were using more, and that hopefully will help you optimize database storage operations, improve query performance, and maximize Vertica's auditing capabilities. So here's the list of features that we'll be covering during this session. The first one will be hierarchical partitioning, and Han will be presenting that. The second one is exploring how DC tables can be extended in order to improve auditing and monitoring. The third one is real combination of obfuscation and masking values, as well as using flattened tables, and we'll show how both can be combined at no extra license cost. The fourth one, presented by Han, will be around database designer. And finally, we'll provide what we call a little support tip to avoid throwing away the keys to your Vertica cluster. So without any further ado, Han will be presenting the first feature.
Thank you, Serge. Hello, everyone. So I would like to talk briefly about hierarchical partitioning today. In an effort to reduce the number of ROS containers, Vertica introduces hierarchical partitioning. Hierarchical partitioning groups older data into yearly partitions, more recent data into monthly partition, and leaves the most recent data in daily partitions. It is done automatically by tuple mover merge-out operations. Some of the benefits include, for versions that are earlier than 9.3, it helps preventing ROS pushback error. This is an error that occurs when the number of ROS containers per projection per node exceeds the default setting of 1024. When this happens, data in memory cannot be written to disk, and as a result, will be lost if the node crashes. For other versions, it helps with data management. It is faster to drop a partition than to deleting rows. So for example, instead of issuing a delete from table where order date between January 1st, 2019 and December 31st, 2019, one can simply issue select drop partition with the name of the table and the partition keys to dropped. And because it helps reducing the delete vectors, hierarchical partitioning will also help speeding up the node recovery. So let's consider a table partition by day, and business requirement is to keep the data for 3 years. So as you can see here, with 3 years of data and into 360 days per year, there are already 1,095 partitions, and it's already exceeding 1,024 limit set by Vertica. In this situation, one can attempt to raise container per projection limit to a higher value, but there can be a negative impact on the database performance. More ROS containers mean more files to read, and more ROS containers mean larger catalog size, which can slow Vertica down. So in this picture, it shows how hierarchical partition works. Each of the boxes represent one ROS container. So on the left-hand side, we see For the inactive years, Vertica consolidates data into one ROS container per year. In the middle of the picture, we can see that for active years, Vertica consolidates data into monthly partition. And on the right-hand side, for the active months, Vertica keeps the data in daily partition. To use hierarchical partition, it is quite simple. You can create a table just the way you normally would and add a function calendar hierarchy day at the end of the partition. And you can specify the number of active months and number of active years that you want to keep. So for example, we can create a table public.store orders, partition the table by date, and use the function calendar hierarchy day and specify 2 months of active data and 1 year of active data. So in this example, orders that are older than 1 year will be grouped into yearly partitions. Orders that are older than 2 months will be grouped into monthly partitions. An order within the last 2 months will be kept in daily partitions. So for the previous 2 years, Vertica can reduce 730 ROS containers to just 2 ROS containers. And for the current year, Vertica can reduce from 360 ROS container to just 70 ROS containers. So in all, Vertica can reduce 1,095 containers down to 72 containers for 3 years of data. So let's take a look at some concrete example. Here I am creating 2 tables, one with regular partition and the other is hierarchical partition table. And I'm going to load the same data into the 2 tables so that we can compare the 2. The data include 10 dates for the month of June, 10 dates for May, 10 dates for April, 10 dates for March, 10 dates for year 2020, and 10 dates for the year 2019. So there are 60 distinct rows. So now let's look at the ROS container of each of the table. If we count the number of ROS containers for each table, we can see for the regular partition table, there are 60 ROS containers. And for the hierarchical partition, we can see that there are only 24 ROS containers. And let's take a look at another year, for example. Here, for the year 2020, as expected, because there are 10 rows for that particular year, we can see there are 10 ROS containers for year 2020. However, for the partition or for a hierarchical partition table, we can see that there's only 1 ROS container for that year. And now I would like to turn back to Serge for his extending DC tables.
Thank you, Han. So I will be covering the next high impact feature, and we're going to explore how we can extend the DC tables to improve auditing and monitoring of your Vertica cluster. So data collector tables are commonly used to monitor or troubleshoot a Vertica cluster. In that picture, this is a pie chart from a Vertica Advisor report that was generated using the DC query executions DC table. So you probably have used data collector tables, when maintaining your Vertica cluster. Data collector tables are also key to a number of system views. For instance, CPU usage system view depends on the DC CPU aggregate by minute DC table. The common problem with DC tables is that they don't retain enough data. So for some DC components, realistically, you won't be able to keep more than a few hours worth of data. And that becomes a problem if you have to analyze a problem that occurred the day before. So each DC component can be controlled via a meta function. Get data collector policy will show you the current settings for the retention policy of a given DC component. And similarly, there is a meta function called set data collector policy that allows you to change how much and how long data will be kept in memory and or on disk. There are some disadvantages, obviously, to increase the retention policy of a DC table. As the DC table grows, the performance will degrade because DC tables are not real or regular Vertica tables. They are more like an external table and don't have many of the improvements in terms of indexing and storage optimizations. Also, we don't provide infinity as a valid option, and de facto, the retention policies cannot be extended to keep all data forever. So we'll be looking at some alternatives where we can extend the DC tables to improve the retention without and still get a good performance when accessing them. So one alternative is to create physical tables to match the DC tables and then periodically copy the data component logs into these physical tables. And if you were to look on a cluster, on a node, if you were to look under the database catalog directory, you will see a data collector subdirectory that contains one or more log files per DC components. So you have here an example of logs for log attempts and log releases. In that same subdirectory, you will find two templates for each component. The first one is a template to create a physical table. So for instance, here, if you look at the create log attempts table.sql template, you will see that this is a vSQL ready script that would create a table mirroring the structure of the corresponding DC table. Similarly, there is another template that you'll find in that subdirectory that will allow you to copy a set of log files into that physical tables. So if you were to look at, for instance, copy log attempts table.sql, this is again a vSQL ready script that would perform a copy into that physical table from the log files. And you will notice that it has all the proper parsing steps to parse the fairly unique format of the DC log components. So using these two things together, you could really automate kind of a system, create a physical table using the scripts. And then on each of your nodes, you could run a cron job that would essentially run that copy. And maybe you set up your cron on a hourly or maybe on a daily basis. And you have now kind of a set of physical tables that kind of extend the retention for your DC tables. One challenge with this approach, however, is that the DC log files are on each Vertica node. So if you wanted to set up a cron job or a schedule to kind of copy things on a regular basis, you would have to set up that cron job on each Vertica node because each node has its own local set of files. If you are running on Eon mode and starting with version 10.1.x, you can use a configuration parameter called data collector cloud prefix, which by default is disabled. And that parameter enables DC log files to be stored on S3 under the communal storage. The value of that parameter indicates the prefix under which the DC log will be located. And here's an example of an S3 path to the DC log files. And if you are in that environment and if you enable that configuration parameter, then all the DC log files from any nodes are into one unique location, which is communal. And then if you wanted to schedule a copy, you would have only one script or one cron job that would copy from that S3 location into the physical tables. Another alternative to also extend the DC tables is to use an out-of-the-box feature of a management console called extended monitoring. The advantage there is that it's really a push-button type of operation. What it allows you is to do a near real-time load in the target cluster. The management console also is aware of where the DC data lives. So if you enable the extended monitoring, it will know how to drive its dashboard from that extended monitoring database as opposed to the DC tables from your source clusters. So the way it works is, and again, management console automate all these steps, but the steps are that on the source clusters to the left, the management console will insert some hooks, if you will, that will push data collector events into Kafka topics. Then management console setups an extra Vertica cluster that will be the MC storage database. And then it will register there and configure a Vertica Kafka scheduler that will constantly look for new messages in various Kafka topics and push them into some physical tables that mirror your DC tables. If you don't want to use the management console, it is possible to implement extended monitoring kind of by hand. And I just highlighted here the steps to create the hook in your source cluster. You create a notifier object, which specifies where your Kafka cluster lives. You would then enable a notification policy for each of the DC components you want to push to Kafka. And then you would create a target database, create physical tables for the DC components, just like you would have done if you wanted to load from files. And then in the target database, you would then configure Vertica Kafka scheduler to constantly monitor Kafka and kind of consume these messages into the physical database. And we provide at the end of the presentation more reference links to get more in details on the exact steps. I'm going to now move on to another high impact feature, and it's really a combination of two features, obfuscation or masking and flattened tables. So obfuscated column, an example would be HR can see a date of birth, but not any other departments. Usually in Vertica, that's implemented via an access column policy. And the policy works like this. It's like a filter. So based on the user role, column values are written as is or masked or obfuscated. A drawback of this approach is that the masking has to be done on the fly on each column value returned by any query. So that can be pretty expensive. A more performant approach is to perform that obfuscation when the data is loaded and to store the masked value as an additional column. One drawback of this approach is that that extra column will count towards your license. So here comes flattened tables, and flattened tables are typically used to avoid frequent joins on dimension tables. So a flattened table is essentially adding some columns, and the value of these columns are derived from a SQL statement, which typically is kind of a lookup into a dimension table. But we're going to see how flattened tables can be also used to store mask values and how you will not be incurring any license penalty for doing so. So we'll go through an example. Here is a function that will obfuscate or de-identify a date of birth. So essentially, it will kind of mix up the date of birth so that it can't be traced to someone, and it's going to have a different formula based on the age of the person. Now, I created in this example a pretty simple table called folks that has 3 columns, a key, a date of birth, and a name, and you can see the content of that table. If I want to mask a date of birth, let's say that I'm not in HR and I cannot see a real date of birth, I could do it on the fly via an access column policy, but more simply by just calling that function whenever I query that folks table. If I look at the license footprint of that folks table running the audit meta function, I can see that the footprint is 45. Now I'm going to build a flattened table to cache that obfuscated value. So the way you create a flattened table is like any regular table, except that some columns will have their value derived from a SQL query. So in this case, I introduce an extra column called masked DOB that I will set using a query that essentially applies the de-identification function to the date of birth for the current key. I populate my flattened table by simply doing an insert into select from. And if I look at the audit function for that flattened tables, I can see that my footprint is still 45, even though I have an extra column. Because the obfuscated column was defined using set using, its values are not populated until the column is refreshed. So there is a meta function called refresh columns that I can run to populate any column that was done with a set using. And then if I look at the end result in my flattened tables, I can see that now I have a date of birth and a masked date of birth. If I run an audit on that flattened tables, I can see my footprint is still 45. And this is really a feature of Vertica that not everybody is aware of, where when you do flattened tables using set usings, the assumption is that value you're copying exists somewhere else in Vertica. So it's really to recognize the fact that we don't want to double count a piece of information even when you replicate it this way. With the flattened tables, I now have both the date of birth and the masked date of birth. So you can create some views to show one or the other date of birth. And then you can set up proper grants to ensure that only privileged users can view the real date of birth. And now we're going to move on to Han for the next high impact feature.
Thank you, Serge. I'd like to talk a little bit about Database Designer, which is a feature that comes out of the box with Vertica. Database Designer assists DBA in designing projections to optimize Vertica database performance. It can run in 2 modes, either comprehensive or incremental. It can be launched from Admin Tools, Management Console, or from SQL commands. For long-running queries, it is recommended to run Database Designer in incremental mode. You create a text file containing the queries that need to be optimized. Invoke the Database Designer from the Admin Tools and follow its prompt. Database Designer will examine the queries and create new projection designs to optimize performance. It writes the projection designs to a text file, which you can choose to have them deploy automatically by Vertica or manually at a later time. There's some tips that I would like to bring up to you. For a smaller table, like a dimension table, it is good to replicate the table across all nodes. For a larger table, it is recommended to segment the large table in the same way when the table are joined together so that the data will be available on the local node for the joint. In my experience, I have come across a case where the query failed to run because it exceeded the memory provided by the resource pool. Initially, we tried to optimize the resource pool, but it was a complicated query and the attempt was not successful. So we decided to pass the query to the database designer and deploy the projection recommended by the database designer. And after that, the query completed in just 15 minutes. And that was for database designer. And now I would like to turn back to Serge.
Thank you, Han. So to conclude our presentation, we wanted to share a customer support kind of tip that both Han and I had to address in support cases. So if you look at a brand new cluster, there are no visible authentication methods in the system table. So if you were to run a select star from client auth, you won't see anything. However, there are authentication methods because on a brand new cluster, you can always log in via the hash passwords that you set when you're creating users, even if you have only dbadmin as your user. So why is that? So in Vertica, there are two default implicit hash authentication methods, one for local and one for host. So how do you throw away the keys? When you create any new local or host authentication methods, for instance, LDAP, that method takes priority over the implicit hash authentication method, and in effect, it becomes the new default. As a result, pre-existing users with the hash passwords might no longer be able to log in. And there are situations where, if you do this for both local and host, you lose any ability to log back into Vertica, especially if you have some issues connecting to LDAP. So how to avoid this? So best practice recommendation, and we have it into the LDAP best practice document, is that before adding any other authentication, you should create explicit default hash authentication methods. When we show you here how to do this, you create a default network and a default local authentications that's of type hash for both host and local. And then you grant that explicit default, if you will, authentication to public to make sure that all your existing users can continue to connect to Vertica while you kind of deploy a new authentication. And this concludes our presentations, just as we won't cover those, obviously, but we provided a list of references for each of the high impact features we covered to go more in depth. And now we're going to open it up to question and answers. So Jeff, can you lead us for this?
Thank you, Serge. Thank you, Han. Thank you for listening to our presentation, all our attendees. We are now ready for Q&A. Great presentation. I know it's difficult to determine which are the most powerful features because there are so many in the product, and hopefully you attendees are getting a lot of benefit from all the features that are available and covered in the other presentations. Everything is being recorded just as a reminder. So let's look into what questions we have here. We've got a few that have popped in, and we're going to get started with the first one I see here, which is when extending DC tables via extended monitoring, does Vertica support SSL encryption to or from Kafka? Serge, I don't know if that's for you or for Han.
Yes, yeah, thanks, Jeff. So I will take that one question. So when as was shown in the presentation, when we extend the DC table via extended monitoring, there are two components talking to Kafka. So from the source cluster, we have a notifier that will produce Kafka messages. And on the target cluster, we have a Vertica scheduler that will consume Kafka messages. Both communications method can be encrypted using SSL. For the notifier part, this is a bit more recent, so that started, I think, in 10.x. For the consuming part, it's been around since I don't know, version 8, if I recall correctly. And so there is plenty of documentation on how to do this. Vertica also supports some type of authentication into Kafka. And again, the documentation provides you a lot of details on how to do that.
Great, Serge. Thank you very much for that. Okay, we've got more questions coming in, which is great. We've got one on hierarchical partitioning. So I already have a non-hierarchical partition. Can I change to hierarchical partition?
I can take this question. So as expected, this is a feature coming out of the box from Vertica. And so if you have an existing table already partitioned and you want to convert it into a hierarchical partition, it is very simple. You can just simply use an outer table and use the function calendar hierarchy date, and that will convert your table into a hierarchical partition.
All right. Thank you, Han. All right, we've got another one here around flattened tables. When using pulse and refresh underscore columns, when should I use update mode versus rebuild mode?
Yeah, so I think I will take this one, Jeff. If you look at the documentation for refresh columns, there are essentially two modes that can be used. One is update, the other one is rebuild. Update mode will essentially perform an update on each row, of your table. Rebuild works a bit differently. It works directly on the column store, if you will, and it's not going to be an update of the whole row. It's going to just be a rebuild of that particular column storage. So in terms of performance, rebuild is definitely faster, and that's definitely the one I would recommend. There are, however, some restrictions that are documented in the documentation. So there may be cases where you cannot use rebuild, but if you can, use rebuild. Rebuild can also be scoped. So instead of doing all the values in a column, you can restrict the scope of a rebuild process by using partition keys. So again, refer to the documentation to see if you can use rebuild, but if you can, you use this. It's definitely way faster.
Great, good tip. Thanks, Serge. We've got another one around hierarchical partitioning, popular topic here. Can hierarchical partitioning benefit us even when we delete the data by ID without date range?
I can take this. So the purpose of hierarchical partitioning is to separate data to group the ROS container, and the benefit of that is that when you need to delete the data, it will be faster to use draw partition. So in the case you want to delete data based on an ID that is not included in the date, hierarchical partitioning, I don't think it's going to help much in this case because since the data is not being partitioned by the key.
Got it. Thank you, Han. All right. Reminder to the attendees, we do have more time for questions if you want to pose them. And as I mentioned, any that we don't get to, because we probably won't, there's so many that will be coming through that we'll answer them offline. Okay, another one just popped in here. What queries are important to include with the database designer? I was told it's important to include delete queries as well as the long running queries. So we got a question around database designer. Serge, is that you or is you, Han?
I think it's more Han, based on the topics we
Yes.
covered.
Yeah, so I can take this one. Yeah, for database designer, yes, any queries that are running for a long time and you wish to optimize for performance, just include them in the database designer, even if that is delete queries, this can also be useful. Also,
Okay.
also would like to add that if you have some queries that are more important than others, you can include that queries multiple times in the same text file. And database designer will just give that query a little more weight than other queries.
Very good. Thanks, Han. Okay, got a range of topics here. Let's see what else is coming in. There's a question around just a little bit more detail around flattened tables. I don't think there's a dedicated session to flattened tables, but it is covered. Um, I can't remember the name of the session, but maybe, Han or Serge, you want to go a little bit more into flattened tables just so this particular person has a little bit more detail, just asking for more details around it, around that particular feature.
Sure. So I think there was a question about whether or not it's like denormalization. So in short, it is very much like denormalization of a schema. So the idea is to read to provide a way to avoid very frequent joins that would be kind of some lookups, if you will, in nature. As I've shown in the presentation, one advantage of the flattened tables is that you don't have to duplicate the information, at least from the license standpoint, because when you perform a lookup, the information already exists in your lookup table. So you can look at flattened tables, really as a way to denormalize your data. The advantage there is that once it's done, you have all the performance of a full-blown table, including partitioning, projections, and so on. So.
Very good. Yeah, more detail there around flattened tables. That's great. Thanks, Serge. Trying to group a few questions because there's so much coming through.
Sure.
More around Han, more around database designer. Questions around better to optimize for load or performance. Can you give any more around database designer, maybe use cases, examples, cases that you get that you work with customers on? Any more color there?
Yes, so any long-running queries that you wish to optimize, you can include them in database designer. Vertica is mainly designed for queries more than loading. So load can be expected a little bit slow because we have multiple projections optimized for queries. So when we do loading, we have to refresh all the projections, and as a result, it can be a little slower. But Vertica optimizes for performance when you do queries. And so it's just better to include those long-running queries in the database designer so that when user run the queries again and again to generate reports, it will be faster.
Got it, Han. And we got a follow-up question here too for database designer. It says the management console always shows recommendations for tuning. Is it a good idea to use database designer and create those projections? Would it have any performance impact on the whole and other queries?
If the queries are performing as expected, I think it's good to leave them that way. If users are seeing slowness in performance, it's always good to optimize them for performance. And it is good to use database designer to include them. There will be some impact on the system performance when you perform database designer because it's analyze all the tables and trying to come up with the design. So it's good to run database designer when you can expect some low load, and also when database designer come up with the projections and designs, and when you deploy them, make sure you deploy and refresh the projections when the load is low so that you won't affect other users. because refresh can take time.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, Han. Nice plug here. We got a Vertica Academy fan. For more information, there are modules that cover information on Database Designer and flattened tables in the Vertica Academy. It's free. Make sure you go to the Vertica Academy. You're going to find so much information there that'll be helpful. Is kind of just supplemental information for what you're learning from this section here. Okay. A bunch more that have come in. Kind of losing track of how many we've already answered. Sir, did you see one, or Han? I want to make sure I'm not going to repeat a question here.
Yeah, so I promoted one.
It's a refresh operation?
Yeah, so there was a question about the time it takes to do a refresh operation. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, there are kind of two modes for refresh. One is rebuild, and one is rebuild, and the other one is update. Rebuild will be faster, and it's to the point in the question, it's really meant about changing the column values and not operate at the row level, which is pretty expensive. So if in that use case for the person asking the question, I would suggest trying to use rebuild and compare, assuming rebuild is an option. But it's rebuild was redone to kind of optimize and improve the performance of the refresh.
Got it, Serge. Yeah, the full question was refresh operation to justify nullify column with set using feature takes us between 30 seconds to 180 seconds. Since Vertica is column store database, I believe it can be faster. I believe it can be improved in the future. So thank you for answering that in terms of telling a little bit more about rebuild, if possible, to use that feature or that capability. All right. Okay, I think there's another one here on Database Designer and projections. How can I clear all Database Designer projections when there are no super projections for some dependent tables? And I don't know if that's you, since you covered DBD in the session.
Yes, that's me, Jeff. So I think this is a little strange because it's almost impossible to not have a super projections. When you create a table, and you start loading data into Vertica, Vertica will automatically create a super projection to store the data. So by default, a super projection is always required and it's always exists. So I don't know in which case that a super projection doesn't exist. But let's just assume that a super projection exists and you have multiple projections coming from Database Designer. And if you want to clear out those projections, you can simply use drop projections and specify projections name. If you accidentally trying to drop a super projection, Vertica will check that, and it will make sure that there is at least one super projection to answer the query. So if you try to drop the last super projection, Vertica will prevent that from happening.
Okay, thanks, Han. It's good to know. Good tip. Let's get some requests here in terms of seeing more example collections of advanced Vertica SQL. So thank you. Comments are welcome as well. So this is in addition to questions. This is, I got to say, one of the most popular sessions. I've done a few of these, and the number of questions that have come in have been pretty overwhelming, which is really good to see. Oh, here's one, and that popped right up with the votes, so it's a popular one. I recently changed many of our partition tables to hierarchical by adding group by expression. I found that reorganized was necessary, which is great. So that's not a question, but that's a comment, which again, we like to hear. Han or Serge, any comments to build on top of that other than nice to see?
I think the participant brought up a good point that I forgot to mention. Yes, when we reorganize the table and convert it into hierarchical partition, make sure to use reorganize. That way, Vertica will reorganize or will regroup all the partitions. Otherwise, we'll have to run that manually.
Very good. Great. Okay, might have time for one or two more if they're there. Serge or Han, any more that we see in the coverage attendees? Oh, this
Yeah,
one.
so yeah.
No one ask. Okay. Yeah, so streaming becoming popular. We had a customer advisory board meeting the other day, and one of our customers, a couple of them, were talking about doing more streaming with Vertica, using some of our capabilities there. So, any thoughts on how to handle streaming or CDC, which like change data capture with Vertica?
Sure. So in terms of streaming, I think there was another session around using Kafka as a way to stream real-time or near real-time information, and I would definitely suggest watching the replay of that session, which I think was yesterday. So out of the box, we do provide Kafka as a way of streaming. There are other type of streaming kind of technologies that we've been looking at, like Pulsar and things like this, and it's also possible to kind of extend Vertica using UDXs to kind of write your own streaming method. So I mentioned Pulsar. That's something that another group within Micro Focus took on themselves to write. Pulsar is very similar to Kafka, but not quite. So they kind of build an integration with Pulsar using the Vertica SDK. So, but if you have specific technology that you want us to integrate with, I mean, we are definitely bring up these ideas because we are always trying to build more integrations with the ecosystem, to get more data in Vertica to perform fast analytics.
It's a great point, Serge. Absolutely. I want to build out our ecosystem and integrate more with those pieces. Cool. Might have time for one, two more. I keep saying that. Here's one here. Having more number of projections will impact data loading as well, right? So question around any impact in data loading with projections. Any experiences
Correct.
there?
Yes, correct. So the more projections there are, the longer they will take to load. Because when we do loading, we load data into all the projections. So it is recommended to have about maybe 4 or 5 projections per table. We don't want to go to have too many projections per table because it's going to affect the loading time.
And if I can add one point to this, sure, is that you may have seen the presentations on Vertica Advisor, which is pretty much a product from the customer experience team, and this is one of the many data points that Vertica Advisor reports on. It's to flag tables that have what we feel too many projections, because again, that can impact performance, for loading. So.
Yep, great point, Serge. And we do have that session at the end of the day. So for Srirang, we'll be covering Vertica Advisor. I think it's the last session of the day. So keep an eye out for that. Definitely attend it. Okay, just got a clarification on an earlier question, which is good one. Is there a performance impact on the database if we create the additional projections based on recommendation? As I understand, not good to have more than 3 projections on a table. So, Han, I don't know if you have that one or Serge.
Yes, I have that one.
Okay.
Right. So whenever we add more projections to Vertica, we can expect the loading time will be impacted a little bit because, as mentioned earlier, every time we load data into Vertica, Vertica will refresh all the projections. So if we have just one projection to load, for example, it will be much faster than we have to load 10 projections. So in that way, we should try to achieve a balance between loading time and query times. And the more projections we have, usually those projections are designed for query performance. So the query performance will be better, but there's this trade-off. First of all, the trade-off is with the disk space. More projections we have, more disk space we will use. And secondly, and most importantly, the more projections we have, the loading time will be a little slower. So try to achieve the good balance between the number of projections and performance. And of course, we don't want to go and have too many projections. I would say about 4 or 5 per table are good. If there are no reason to create other projections, then we should not create additional projections.
Very good, Han. Thank you. Okay, Han and Serge, anything else you want to recap or summarize before we go and wrap it up? We're coming up to the top of the end of the session. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So just a reminder that the presentation includes a number of links to go more in depth to any of the topics we covered. So these are links to the specific documentation sections, as well as blogs or best practices that have been written. And I think the Vertica Academy is definitely a good resource also to kind of learn by example more, for various topics covered there. And always feel free to send us emails or pose questions on the forum for Vertica. So.
Yep, that's exactly right, Serge. And Han, anything else you want to just to recap or before we conclude?
No, I think I'm good.
Great. So to our audience, hope you've enjoyed this session. As you can tell from our best practices session, we take a lot of pride in the customer excellence team that we have, full of knowledge. You can find more on Vertica Academy. Attend more of the sessions, please. So I want to thank you, though, for attending and for your great participation. That was a record number of questions, at least for me, for today and yesterday. So great job by our audience. Again, if we weren't able to answer your questions today, we'll do our best to respond directly via email. And again, our engineers will be available in the developer lounge. Make sure you attend that at the end of the day. You're going to meet even more of Vertica's finest engineers and customer success engineers. And please note that a replay of today's event and a PDF copy of the slides will be available on demand shortly. And of course, we invite you to share them with your colleagues. Again, thank you to our audience today. Don't forget to type the session code in the Analyze to Win section on the event navigation panel. Note that there will be a short message from our sponsors that'll encourage you to stick around and catch coming up. And this concludes the breakout session. Have a great day. We hope you enjoy Vertica Unify 21. Thank you very much.